episode of Rural Vibe Matters podcast, where we dive into rural development issues around the world. I'm Vahe, I'm your host today, and we are joined by Adam Beswick, a sustainable development professional, currently interning in the village of Kalavan, Armenia. Adam, thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for, first of all, having me on the podcast, and second of all, having me here with you in Kalavan.
It is our pleasure. So let's start with some background questions. Could you tell us a bit about yourself, about your journey into sustainable development?
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, I'm Adam, I'm 26 years old, and I have sort of started my journey maybe about a year ago, I would say, into the field of sustainable development. I studied, well, actually 3 years ago, because I studied 2 years at Uppsala University and the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. I did a degree in sustainable development there. And this degree takes place in a center called CEMUS, which is the Center for Development and Environmental Studies. And it's a transdisciplinary center where you have expertise from the Agricultural University and Uppsala, and they come together, and it's run by students, and there's this, there's this big focus on trying to connect researchers and practice and be very practical in our learning as well. And that was a really inspiring place to be, and also taught me a lot of valuable lessons and how to communicate sustainability and systems theory and complexity and all of this. So it was a fun 2 years.
Cool. So as you said, you have recently graduated from the university, and I also know that you worked on different projects in different places. So how did your internship specifically in Kosovo, how it was, how it influenced your approach to rural development or development in general?
Mm-hmm. I think I should preface by saying that I did a 5-month internship at the Swedish Embassy in Pristina, the capital city in Kosovo. Sweden is very active in the development sector in Kosovo through the Swedish International Development Agency, or SIDA, as some of you may know it as. And every year they have a set of interns that come for 5 months and participate in development projects. In my case, also because of my sustainability background, I was also writing some reports on sort of the sustainability portfolio and how things were going. But it was a very interesting, and I think for me a very formative experience. And I'll tell you a story that I think influences my approach to development in a way. It's a story of what not to do, in a sense. So, as we know, there are climate changes and biodiversity loss, and people are trying to figure out, okay, how can we mitigate and adapt? And a very common method of doing this is to try to reforest. We know forests can sequester carbon, they are home to biodiversity and a lot of other things. So just generally a good thing. So the Office of the President in Kosovo launched an initiative called 1 million trees, and the idea was to plant 1 million trees in Kosovo, and in doing so contributing to Kosovo's ability to sequester carbon and mitigate some of the emissions. With the help of, there was UNDP and EU Lex, which is a rule of law, sort of EU branch in Kosovo, they set out and they started planting different trees. So they went to this field outside one of the biggest coal power plants in Kosovo, and started planting, taking pictures. It was all very lovely. And then a group of locals approached the project managers, and they say, "Oh, what are you guys doing?" And they're like, "Oh, we're planting trees, and it's very important because we need to mitigate our carbon emissions, etc., etc." And the locals were like, "Yeah, I mean, sure, of course, I get that, but this piece of field that you're planting on right now is frequented by different villages and different goats and sheep herders. So it's sort of a transit for all these different mountain villages here. You can plant these trees, but I can guarantee you that the goats are going to eat the tree saplings and everything. And, the project managers got all defensive and said, no, we've done our research and we've decided this is the perfect spot, etc., etc. Well, then a few months later, they go back and they're going to, monitor the progress and take some pictures for social media and whatever. And lo and behold, there aren't a lot of trees left, so to say, and there are a pack of very, very happy and well-fed goats instead. And of course, this story is absurd in a way. But it sort of shows some of the deficits, at least especially when it comes to sustainable development and environmental governance in some areas, that there is still this lack of talking to people and recognizing that when you create this sort of project, it's important to also include local stakeholders and to have them on board in a way, because one big problem again with development projects is that after the project cycle sometimes it sort of ends there. So there is this idea about resilience. How do you make a project that stays beyond project funding? And to me at least, by engaging and understanding local contexts, you're able to, I think, find ways and projects that are more suited to people and also more sustainable. I can go on about that, but I think it's a funny story to kick us off.
Thank you so much for this story. It really reflects the challenges and the issues that we have in development projects. And now I will move to the next question, which is kind of very interesting for me as a development professional. So during your time in Swedish Embassy in Pristina, what were some of the challenges you encountered while working on development projects in Kosovo? So this is something that I'm sure that would interest also our followers who are working or who are interested in working in development sector, in development projects in general.
There are a lot of challenges. You have, of course, the challenge of being a development practitioner and what that means, and sort of the job of, in this case, being sort of a donor, but also a project coordinator and whatnot. But then you also have the challenges of the context. And in the case of Kosovo, it's a challenging context because of the problems of lack of recognition by the international community, also lack of institutional development, I would say. For those who aren't aware, there was a war in 1999 in Kosovo, which ended in a NATO intervention. Kosovo was under then a UN administration government for about 10 years, and then declared independence in 2008. So we're talking about essentially a country that is 15 years old, that still struggles with sort of basic questions about like what does it mean to be Kosovar, and how do we want to build our society in some ways. And in that sort of, I think, being such a young country, I noticed that one of the difficulties was trying to explain the importance of, I don't mean the environment necessarily, but sort of the importance of environmental governance, the importance of ecosystem services, the importance for Kosovo's development, that it does not sort of go full steam ahead and in the process irreversibly, or at least in the long term, destroying natural assets that exist. I studied forests, so of course I sort of go in from that angle, but an area I found very challenging was the forest issue in Kosovo. Just to put some context here again, Kosovo is one of the most forested areas in the Balkans, but it also faces serious issues with illegal logging, illicit destruction of biodiversity and forest ecosystems. And largely, one of the big drivers of this is that there is still a lack of a central heating or central energy system in Kosovo, which means that for a lot of rural people, if you want to not freeze during winter or you want to cook or something like that, you have to use wood biomass in a way. Of course, this creates an issue when you've got, I mean, it's a very densely populated country as well. You've got people going into the forests and sort of cutting trees, and there isn't a lot of monitoring, and of course, like when it comes to at least sustainable forestry, cutting trees is part of that, but it's how you do it. It's about being selective, it's about recognizing which trees to cut, which trees have an important role within the system, and you can achieve that, but then you need people who know what they're doing, and you need to be able to communicate this as well. And in the case of Kosovo, that was lacking. So you're finding yourself, Sweden, we're a forested country, and you're working in this context where essentially you're going to government or you're going to development partners. But one of the big gaps or one of the big voids in these discussions of trying to solve this issue is that sort of the locals or people who actually use wood biomass are not there.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about, their needs in terms of being a beneficiary, for example, and I found myself sometimes wondering, like, do we really understand their needs in this case? Why don't we go and talk to them? And this is a challenge, and you can design really nice and cool sounding projects with awesome deliverables and whatever, but to me, if you don't even think that something like that's important, I'm not sure the project will work in a way.
So basically you are raising very critical issue, Adam, when most of the time what is happening, like professionals or agencies, they are writing their projects, they are developing their projects from their offices, and beneficiaries, or I would say even like partners, they are somehow excluded from this process. Like in ideal scenario, they are just engaged in this implementation phase, but not, we had several discussions with you, not in the design phase and not in the evaluation phase, but it is crucial both to engage them in the design phase, so you have like super targeted projects, and it is not just about like developing a targeted project, but it is also about partners having this ownership over your projects, having this commitment towards your project. So yeah, that is very crucial issue, and this takes me to the next question, and I want you to share a specific project where you faced hurdles. What were the key takeaways from that experience?
Yeah, so I decided to stay in Kosovo for another 6 months after my internship ended, and largely to pursue sort of my own project in a way. And it relates back to this forestry question. I needed to write a master's thesis, and you've been in this sort of academic context where, as you were saying, these questions about ownership and about resilience, about participation and normative approaches to sustainability practice in a way, at least in the development sense. And I found myself feeling like, I'd had this amazing opportunity to work with forest related issues. I noticed there appears to be a deficit, not only in how policy on forests are made, but also how development projects are created and implemented. So I felt like, okay, I want to do a research about this. I want to try to also engage with the people who weren't involved in these processes and see what could I learn from them. There's a huge literature out there on participatory environmental governance, and it explains, why actually ensuring a wider participation is important. In the case of transition as well, you might be able to find sort of networks or roles or practices that are deeply cultural in a context that a desktop research wouldn't reveal. So I set myself out to do this. And it was interesting taking a step away from the Swedish Embassy and for once not representing SIDA or Sweden, but actually representing academia or even, being a student. So I set out with this idea to conduct different interviews, and I had a methodology called transition management. I'm sure we might get into that later, but long story short, it tries to facilitate transition by bringing people together and having them participate in different activities. So I wanted a wide variety of different actors to be involved in this to get a holistic sort of view. But one of the issues is once you take a step outside that embassy world, all these people, ministers, politicians, become very difficult to access all of a sudden. And I also found it, ideally with transition management as well, you're supposed to bring people together into like one room, and then we can, talk together and say, hey, so how do we see forests in 50 years in Kosovo to look like? And then, the idea is that it's supposed to be a bit uncomfortable as well. So if you're a minister and you're there, and then you're actually in the same room as a rural community or rural community members, and the idea also is that they can learn from each other in a way, and also hopefully, and this is what I hope to prove, that actually it would be productive and you'd come up with targeted interventions that might be more sustainable or resilient, and also create the sense of ownership. And currently the government would go and we've got lovely forests behind us, by the way, as you can see, but they would go and say, okay, you cannot touch this, for example, and then locals do it anyways, because this sort of arrangement, this role with the forest is something that's been top down and not necessarily agreed or shared. But if you come together and you explain the importance of a biodiverse forest, and also maybe also recognize that the community still needs timber in a way, but you can find solutions where extracting that timber is sustainable, then you might not need to pay for a guard with an AK-47 to sit and watch the forest, because actually the people there understand, and they feel like this losing my words, but this arrangement is legitimate, and it takes time, it takes effort. This is one of the things. I only had 6 months to do this sort of research. I should have maybe needed a year or more to really get these results. But I think it shows that it's worth talking to people and respecting knowledges and seeing that plurality of different approaches, and it reveals things that maybe solutions that we didn't envision before. We couldn't get there unless we brought them together and put them in the same room.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. This is very meaningful, and we were also discussing, this is most of the time when we design some project or we enter to any community, we are entering there with some assumptions. Mm-hmm. You were talking about forest management, how locals, how is the locals' attitude towards forest, towards nature, etc. And I think the main takeaway from this part is that any time when you are doing a project, you should forget about your experience, about your past experience, and you should have no assumptions about community, about their issues, about their challenges, and it should be from the blank page. You have to enter without any assumptions, to understand the realities, the context, as you were saying, the key players, why they are cutting the trees, why they are not cutting the trees, etc., in order to understand the local context. So no assumptions when you are doing a development project. So we basically talked a lot about the challenges, both based on your experience, and also in general what challenges our sector development projects are facing. Now I want us to move to a bit more positive side of things, and now I want us to discuss about the lessons and the changes that we have or we would love to see in development sector, especially in rural development. So from your perspective, what aspects of especially rural development would you like to see changed based on your experience in Kosovo, like generally?
Yeah, I think there needs to be, this might not be controversial, but I think there needs to be a bit of a rethink about the role of the development practitioner. I think from my perspective, there needs to be, we need people who are comfortable and happy to facilitate processes. And I mean, like as a development practitioner, that instead of going in and saving someone, I know this has been, critiqued, and I don't think anyone really has that approach, at least I hope not. But to recognize that actually with sort of money and with donor support and capacity, you and I as a development practitioner should try to facilitate a process where governance and where sort of governance can happen without there needing to be a project. So, okay, let's go to Kosovo, let's go to a rural village where you have in next to a forest or adjacent to a public forest, say. So, what I mean here is these rural areas depend on a finite resource. Like there are only so many trees, and these trees take a while to regrow, etc. So sort of having this approach of every man for himself and to keep warm isn't going to work. As a development practitioner, what I would be interested in is seeing what sort of forums or what sort of methods or roles or networks can I facilitate by bringing people together where they themselves can come together and come up with governance solutions to these problems. And it could be that we come together, we recognize, well, you know what, like this family probably has a bigger need for timber because they have a sick family member or something like that. And then everyone else also like is able to adhere to that, to recognize that. And what that means is bringing people together and having them feel like they can share these things. So it's participatory environmental governance in a way. And what I would like to see then as a development practitioner, especially with rural development, is that we try to, again, empower is a bit of a buzzword maybe, but to facilitate such process. And I like the ABCD approach. You could explain it better than I could, but it is about essentially, in this case, trying to create these networks. And maybe these community networks exist. In some villages there are community spaces and people do get together. But then it's about, okay, what sort of network or governance role can we establish with a municipality, for example, or with a agency? Is there a way we can bring the agency closer to these forest communities in this case? And how would that look like? And what sort of, me as a development practitioner, what happens if I get them together? What will they talk about? What will they come up with? And will they come up with a way to keep that communication and deliberation closer? And also with Kosovo as a final point, most sectors in society, and this goes from like the office of the Prime Minister down to your sort of rural community member, people were not happy with how forests were governed. The situation is bad, everyone knows it, and people, but still like this bad system is still going on. So in a way, by bringing people together, I think it presents solutions or it allows these people to bridge these things. And actually, like, this is something very important. These things are solvable. Like when it comes to governance in Kosovo, like, okay, I mean, the energy situation is really it's a challenge, so it will put pressure on the forest. But a lot of these things can be solved by bringing people together and facilitating these processes. At least that's what I believe. So
cool. And you know, in our sector, we like to talk a lot about successes, about I mean, you know, like having all these success stories, articles, videos, etc. So most of the time, I mean, in the vast majority of cases, we don't have situation when we talk about like failures or things that didn't work as expected. So now, as we are having super open discussion, I want to understand, were there any like approaches or strategies that didn't work as expected in Kosovo, and how did you adapt, both as a professional and maybe also like institutional wise, like your organization where you were working in?
So I don't think I was long enough with the embassy to fully see the project cycle. It was still, I mean, the idea of the internship is to learn and to open up and to expose and sort of learn by doing, etc. I think one thing I noticed was the administrative burden on regular staff at the embassy. So quite often we should be on the field meeting partners, connecting with communities. I know not all development partners want donors to be there, but for me at least, I felt like it was important, especially when we're doing environmental governance, you know, and I feel strongly about participation and salience and bringing people together. I need to also put my mouth where I eat, and I put my hands. Well, I don't know how the saying goes, but you see what I mean. Like sort of practice what I preach, I suppose. But quite often the amount of documentation that was required within sort of internal processes kept becoming more and more, and then CEDA would come with new ideas. Okay, you need to do this, and it sort of negatively impacted our ability to see, to learn, also to hold partners accountable to some degree. You know, obviously when we enter a partnership, we do it because we trust them, and that trust needs to be there. Like, the worst thing is having someone hanging over you and not trusting what you're doing. But I think also, like, you know, you're a representative of Sweden, and when it comes to forests, for example, like, I think also for the project as well, like, it's good when you have a donor that's present and active and can take questions and can also maybe learn from some of the challenges a partner has on the field, for example. It's not always obvious, you know, a partner comes and they say, oh, we have this and this challenge, and it becomes abstract because you're not the one on the field, right? So there is this opportunity to learn as well. But of course the administration is important. But yeah, no, so there were different times, and I noticed, like, towards the end of the year, for example, like, all my colleagues were super stressed, and it was just not a nice sort of environment sometimes. And I think that the development is fun and it's stimulating, and for me at least, I felt like to keep it that way, there needs to be this maybe more time or more space given to actually meet people.
Cool. During the recent days that you are in Kalavan, and we had several talks about like development challenges and possibilities, etc. You mentioned about a model which sound like very interesting model for rural development. It is called transformation management model. Could you explain what that is and how you applied it in your work?
Yeah, so yesterday I had a workshop here in Kalavan with different community members and also some representatives from academia in Armenia, which was very fun. So I worked with a methodology called transition management, and the idea of transition management is exactly sort of what I'm talking about now, is try to bridge not only gaps between a practitioner and sort of the people you research, or in this case a community, but also try to bring in academia into that fold, and to try to create new networks in ways where research can be more applied and can do more to solve like practical governance issues. There is a critique within academia that when it comes to sustainability challenges, these challenges are systemic. And what it means to be systemic is that they're complex, they overlap between ecological, economic, social, cultural understandings. So if you want to try to change these systems, because in a way, when it comes to climate change and our sustainability challenges, the problems are more how we operate as a culture, as a species. The way our material impact on the planet, the way we use our land, for example. Land use is one of the biggest issues now, because we cut down forests for monocultures, or we, we open mines, we take very rich biodiverse regions and convert them into like plantations, all these things. But we don't do them because we hate the environment or anything like that. It's just sort of, we have this system where you need to sell and make money, and we understand that. And in a way, so the idea is that how do we solve these issues? Like, we've been talking, we understand the issues. Science has gone in. We have excellent research from natural scientists, social scientists that explain, like, look, these are the issues, these are the problems. But then it sort of stops there in a way. And the transitions that probably we need to do, the sustainability transitions, Agenda 2030, but also post-Agenda 2030, we're not meeting these targets. And then the argument is, why aren't we not meeting these targets? Well, because they're systemic. Okay, they're systemic. How do you solve systemic issues? And transition management tries to go in and say, well, you solve systemic issues by, first of all, elucidating the system. What's the system? What are the interactions? When we talked about forests in Kosovo, for example, this is about why are people cutting? What's the energy situation like? What's the cultural context like, and how do they reinforce each other, and etc. So you want to do that. And then you also want to try to bring people together to come up with an idea of where we're heading, an ideal future in a way. So transition management tries to bring people together, and they tries to say, okay, we have this issue, it's a systemic issue. In order to break these systems, we need to be aware of them, but we also need to chart a course for the future. And what I love with transition management is that it's a very creative way of doing this. We have there's such a thing within the model called strategic activities. And what that means is you bring people together and you say, okay, let's look at this systemic configuration. How should this look like in 50 years' time? I mean, it's such a... Visioning, yeah. It's such a novel thing because, Agenda 2030 feels sometimes a bit abstract, but that's in 7 years. More like 6 years, right? Imagine coming together, like all of these different social groups, and trying to plan for the next 50 years. I mean, the fact that it's so hard also shows that as a sort of culture, and again, this is a systemic thing, we as a sort of system and consciousness and understanding and how we plan, we're not very good at thinking that far. And what's also fun is when you, instead of having a discussion, what do we need to do in the next 2 years to solve these issues? And then, we understand the current systemic configurations and we go, we want to do this, but that's not possible because of blah, blah, blah. If you expand the time horizon to 50 years, for example, I mean, it just opens up this new space for discussion. And all of a sudden, like, people, and I've noticed this using transition management, people from community members to even members of parliament and advisors to prime minister, etc. Sort of, first of all, the first reaction was, why are we doing this? This is weird. And then, they would say, I want the forest to be teeming with life, and I I want the forests to expand. I wish we weren't so reliant on them. And I think, if we could come together and try to manage these resources in a different way. So all of a sudden, like, we're having these really interesting points. And then I would say, well, okay, that's the first step. Now we have an idea of where we want to go. Then we work backwards. This is called backcasting. So then you come up with steps. Okay, what needs to change in order to get to this idea?
More technical things like.
Yeah, and as a last point, I know I waffle a lot, but with sustainability transitions, there isn't a straightforward solution. I think everyone should be very critical of voices that say, sustainability it's an easy thing. It's just about substituting inputs, or whatever. And of course that's part of it, but it's more than that. Actually, I think the sustainability challenge is a very interesting opportunity as well for us to have this debate about how do we want to live as people. Here in Kalavan, for example, how do we want Kalavan to be? Not only for us, but for the planet and for the environment. And when you open that space and people are able to bring their passions and their love or respect for nature into that policy discussion, it becomes a lot more fun, I think, and more important, and also more resilient and contextually relevant as well.
Cool. So now we are gradually moving to Kalavan, and at the end of our podcast I want to shift our discussion, our focus to your current internship in Kalavan, Armenia, and I want to understand what motivated you to come and to work in this particular village.
Yeah, it's still a bit surreal that I'm here. There was a big community sort of dinner last night, and I was sitting there and everyone was cheering and eating, and I was like, how did I end up here? Like, what did I do? Well, what I did, I contacted an organization called Forum Synergies, and I received a tip from a friend who said, I know this organization, I think you'd be interested. Forum Synergies had a scholarship program where they would help provide funding for you to intern with some kind of organization involved in rural development. So I sent them an email saying, hey, I'm interested in rural development. I also ran a permaculture sort of community project in Uppsala for a year. So I sort of approached it as saying, I'm interested in agroecology. I wouldn't mind just practicing my skills in permaculture. But so I got called to sort of, not an interview, but more of a face-to-face meeting with the organization. And as I was explaining my interests, I explained my experience with transition management and how I saw development, or how I think development should work. They said, what? I know you said you wanted to go to Italy and grow tomatoes and stuff, but you should come to Armenia and meet ABCD Innovation, because there is a lot of overlap, this sort of asset-based approach, and seeing and respecting community members and looking for positivity, and instead of approaching somewhere and saying what is not here, you go and you see what's here and what are the skills and what are the talents of an area, and work with that in a way. So I received an opportunity to come here, and I've been here for 5 days now. We've been working on some different projects, meeting the locals, trying to get immersed in the local context. It's also been a very fun time to be here, because we've had ethnographers in the village come and do research. Currently there are some archaeologists who are coming here and doing some excavating, I suppose, on an old site. They just walked past here as I'm speaking. It's an opportunity, I think, for me to see how does an asset-based approach look like, what are some of the practical challenges, but also for me to practice this sort of immersion and to go in somewhere and to have that reflexive process. I mean, I'm reflecting all the time about what I'm seeing and how it makes me feel, and what that says about my understanding of the world in some ways. Try to take away biases, or, I mean, you can't entirely do that, but be aware of that and reflect on that, and also be open for people to come to you and to make an impact on you. And I feel I've only been here for 5 days, but there are people in the village who have resonated with me, who have left a mark on me. And that sort of vulnerable position is actually, for me, very productive, fun, and meaningful in a way.
Interesting. I'm just curious, are there any like parallels between your experiences in Kosovo and what you are witnessing here in Kalavan? Any similarities or?
There are similarities and there are big differences as well. Like for one, landing in Yerevan and then driving here to Kalavan, a lot of this sort of like a context in transition, I think, is one that Kosovo and Armenia share. So you have, in the case of Armenia, the collapse of the Soviet Union and then becoming a republic, and sort of that economic transition to a capitalist system. In Kosovo, you have a similar thing as well. You had a socialist sort of fabric of society, and then of course the war, and what you see is that this development is quite uneven in a way. So you've got Pristina, where there's so much money being put in right now, and it's sort of going so quick that I think even people in Pristina are starting to get worried or anxious about, well, all these huge skyscrapers being built, what are they for? And they're so expensive, but like none of us can afford it. Who are buying these? This sort of thing. And then you've got Yerevan, of course, which is the big city, the dominant player in Armenia. And then you have everyone else, sort of in the rural areas, who are forgotten or left behind, should we say. So I see parallels there with Kosovo and Armenia. Where I think some of the similarities end, though, is that where I think Kosovo still struggles, or at least rural Kosovo, are having issues with how they relate to their natural environments, forests in particular, because of the illegality and the laws, and it's becoming more draconic as well, the top-down approach. So people are very disenfranchised from their environments, and I think that is a major cause for why people are leaving the villages and stuff. And then coming here to Kalavan, and of course, the road there, for those who haven't been here, to get up, it's up in the mountains, we can say, or the hills, and it's a 7-kilometer drive up like this, on a dirt track that is not always the best condition, So it creates practical challenges, like getting doctors here, getting teachers, all of this. But despite this, I feel like there is a different sort of attitude and different solidarity to Kalavan than I experienced in other villages in Kosovo. It may exist, maybe I just haven't come across it. And I'm not saying it's just because of ABCD or something like that, but certainly this sort of asset-based approaches and trying to use and integrate the locals into rural development work and activities and have it come from the communities themselves. It has, in my opinion, resulted in a very dynamic and open and fun and creative atmosphere. I'm inspired being here, I'm inspired being in Kosovo as well, but for different reasons,
Cool, thank you so much, Adam. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for being in Kalavan. And also, it is a two-way process.
Mm-hmm.
You are learning from us, from the community, and also we are learning from your experience. And thanks for sharing your valuable insights on rural development, challenges, strategies, some ideas how we can address those challenges. And it has been a pleasure to have you on our first episode of our podcast. And to our listeners, stay tuned for more, I would say, enlightening discussions, because we are going to have monthly podcast episodes starting from October. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.